Mike Tyson beats thugs attacking homeless man. Crowd left in shock. The alley was the kind of place that people avoided if they could help it. The kind of place where the unwanted lived, tucked away behind buildings and forgotten by the world. The sun had long set, and the cool, damp air hung heavy with the smell of trash and decay. It was an urban wasteland, untouched, unclean, and often ignored. A homeless man, worn and battered, sat against the brick wall. His face was haggard, eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion. His clothes were torn and caked in dirt. He had long since stopped asking for help, stopped expecting any kind of compassion from the people who passed him by. His cup, half full of change, lay next to him, but he hadn't moved to pick it up in hours. He wasn't looking for coins anymore, just a moment of peace, but that was a luxury he couldn't afford. Then, the sounds of laughter echoed down the alley. Loud and mocking, it sliced through the quiet like a blade. 3 men appeared at the far end of the alley, their figures silhouetted by the streetlights, casting long shadows on the ground. They weren't in a hurry, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes scanning the surroundings for something, or someone, to entertain them. The homeless man instinctively shrank back, trying to make himself as small as possible. He knew what was coming. They always found him. Always. "Look at this," the tallest one sneered, stopping in front of him. His voice was sharp and cruel. "A little rat in the corner. Think you're too good for the world?" The homeless man didn't answer. He didn't look up. He just huddled against the wall, his hands gripping his coat tightly. His heart raced, knowing what was next. It wasn't the first time they had targeted him. It wouldn't be the last. The man kicked the cup away, sending it tumbling across the ground, coins scattering like confetti. The others laughed, their voices dripping with amusement. The homeless man winced, but said nothing. They were just getting started. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "You're just a fucking joke," the second thug growled, walking over to the homeless man and shoving him in the chest. The force knocked him back, and he hit the wall hard, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. He didn't move, barely managing to breathe. He had learned long ago not to fight back. Fighting made it worse. "Come on, get up," the third thug taunted, kicking the homeless man's legs, knocking him off balance. "What's the matter? You think you're special or something? You don't belong here, man. You're nothing." The homeless man's head was spinning. Pain coursed through him with every movement. His ribs felt like they were going to snap, and his vision blurred. His arms trembled, but he didn't move. He didn't want to make it worse. "Don't act like you're better than us," the second thug continued, leaning down close to the man. He grabbed him by the hair and yanked his head back, forcing the homeless man to look at him. "You don't get to be like them," he spat, motioning toward the rest of the world outside the alley. "You're nothing. Just a fucking waste." The homeless man's throat closed up. He couldn't even speak anymore. The words lodged in his throat, suffocating him, but he could say nothing. His body hurt too much, his mind too tired to respond. He just wanted it to stop. The thug with the snake tattoo on his neck stepped closer, sneering down at the man. "What? No begging this time," he laughed. "You don't even have the energy left to beg? Pathetic." The homeless man blinked, trying to focus, trying to find the will to move. The world around him was closing in, the dark alley growing smaller with each passing second. The thugs weren't going to stop. They never did. One of the thugs kicked his stomach, hard enough to make him cough up a small trickle of blood. The pain was searing, and he gasped for air, feeling like he was choking. But the thugs only laughed harder. It was like a game to them, a twisted amusement. "Come on, beg for your life," the first thug said, crouching down in front of him. "Maybe if you beg enough, we'll let you go." Maybe. The homeless man could barely breathe, let alone beg. His body was numb. His hands were cold, his face bloodied and bruised. He barely had the strength to lift his head. But he was a survivor in the smallest, most desperate sense of the word. His entire existence had been about surviving moments like this, about taking what they gave him and hoping to make it through. "You ain't shit," the second thug hissed, standing over him now, looking down with disgust. "Get up. Show me you're worth something." The homeless man couldn't move. He could barely feel his legs, his arms shaking with exhaustion. He tried to push himself up, but a sharp kick to his ribs sent him sprawling back onto the cold pavement. Pain exploded in his chest, and he gasped, the world around him tilting. The third thug took a step closer, cracking his knuckles. "You're wasting our time," he growled. "You should be grateful we even let you breathe. You're nothing but a fucking rat in a hole." The homeless man felt something inside of him snap, but it wasn't strength. It was something darker, a kind of numbness that settled deep in his chest, pushing all the fear and pain aside. He didn't know if it was anger or hopelessness, but it burned in his gut, making his hands twitch as if he might fight back. And just as that thought flickered, a voice echoed through the alley, low and steady, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "Enough!" The thugs froze, their cruel laughter dying in their throats. The homeless man's head turned, his blurred vision desperately searching for the source of the voice. The figure stepped into view from the shadows at the far end of the alley, towering over the thugs, casting a long shadow. The light from the street lamp revealed his face, unmistakable. The alley grew eerily silent as Tyson's figure emerged from the shadows, his towering presence causing the thugs to pause. For a brief moment, everything seemed frozen. Time slowed, the cruel laughter of the thugs fading into an almost suffocating stillness. The homeless man, still curled on the cold concrete, could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a change that was palpable. His vision, blurry and clouded by the pain and fear, focused on the figure standing at the end of the alley. The voice that had cut through the violence now hung in the air, hanging over the thugs like a judgment. Tyson said nothing as he walked toward them. His steps were measured, purposeful, each movement exuding power. The thugs had expected someone weak, someone they could intimidate and push around, but they hadn't anticipated this. The thug with the snake tattoo, still holding his ground, looked at Tyson with defiance. "What, you think you're gonna stop us? You don't belong here. This isn't your turf, man," he said, his voice shaking but attempting to mask his fear. He swung the chain in his hand, its clinking sound ringing out in the silence, a hollow threat. Tyson stopped just a few feet away from them, his eyes scanning the group. His gaze was unrelenting, and the air seemed to thicken as he stood there, waiting. He didn't need to say anything, but when he did, his voice was deep, clear, and unyielding. "I'm not here to talk," Tyson said, his words low but filled with an undeniable force. "I'm here to make sure this ends right now." The tattooed thug gritted his teeth, anger flashing in his eyes. He swung the chain again, aiming it directly at Tyson's head. The chain whipped through the air, but Tyson was too quick. He ducked just as the chain grazed the top of his head, narrowly missing. In a flash, Tyson grabbed the thug's wrist, stopping the chain mid-swing, and yanked it from his grasp with a brutal twist. The thug let out a yelp of pain as his wrist was forced backward. Before he could react, Tyson's fist connected with his stomach in a brutal, fast strike that sent the thug doubling over. Tyson didn't wait for him to recover. A quick uppercut sent the thug crashing to the ground, gasping for air, unable to catch his breath. "Stay down," Tyson growled as he stood over him. His voice was calm but firm, like a father reprimanding a child. The remaining two thugs froze. The wiry one with the broken plank clenched his weapon tighter, trying to regain some control, but his hands shook. He was scared. He didn't want to be the next target. "We don't want no trouble," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the tremor was evident. Tyson didn't flinch. He had already moved past the first thug, his eyes locking onto the wiry man. "You should have walked away," Tyson said, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge. "Now you've made it personal." The wiry thug swung the plank with desperation, his aim wild. Tyson sidestepped the attack effortlessly, the plank slicing through the air, missing him by inches. Tyson's counter was immediate. With one fluid motion, he grabbed the thug's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down to the ground. The thug let out a pained scream as his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Tyson held him there, his strength unmatched, and the thug's body trembled beneath him. "I gave you a chance to stop," Tyson said, his voice colder now, his grip tightening. "Now you're going to learn what happens when you don't listen." The third thug, the big one, who had been hanging back, took a step forward, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. He gripped a heavy crowbar in his hand, the metal gleaming in the faint light. "You think you can just beat us all up? You're outnumbered." "Tyson," he growled, swinging the crowbar at Tyson's head. Tyson, quick as a flash, ducked under the swing, his body moving like a coiled spring. With one sharp movement, Tyson knocked the crowbar out of the thug's hands, sending it clattering across the alley. Before the thug could react, Tyson's fist connected with his face, the punch so powerful it lifted the thug off his feet. The thug's head snapped back, and he crashed to the ground, his body limp. Tyson stood over him, his breath steady, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who had seen and fought through much worse. "You want to try me again?" Tyson asked, his voice a low growl, though there was no need for an answer. The big thug was out cold, his body crumpled on the pavement, unable to move. The homeless man, still trembling against the wall, could barely believe what he was seeing. His mind, clouded by the fear and the chaos, tried to process the overwhelming reality unfolding before him. He had lived his whole life on the streets, barely surviving, trying to avoid these kinds of encounters. And yet, here was Mike Tyson, this legend, coming to his defense without hesitation. The remaining thug, the tattooed one, still clutching his broken wrist, looked at his fallen friends and back at Tyson, his expression one of disbelief and fear. The alley was deathly silent, save for the heavy breathing of the thugs, some of whom were starting to regain their bearings. But Tyson wasn't finished. The tattooed thug, now on his knees, tried to crawl away, his face contorted in pain. "Please, man," he gasped. "We're sorry. We didn't know who you were. Okay? Just let us go. We won't do it again." Tyson stepped forward, his footsteps heavy with intent. "It's too late for apologies," he said, his voice colder than before. "You don't get to do what you just did and walk away like nothing happened." The tattooed thug looked up at him, fear in his eyes. "Please, just let us go. We didn't mean it, okay? We just wanted to have some fun." Tyson's gaze locked onto him, unwavering. "You thought hurting someone for fun was okay? You think that's how you get respect?" Tyson's voice was like steel, cutting through the thug's desperation. "You don't get to decide when it's okay to stop. That's my choice now." The alley was charged with an intensity that vibrated through the thick air, the thugs now fully aware that they were no match for Tyson. Yet, despite their fear, they were still unwilling to back down completely. The tattooed thug, still on his knees, looked up at Tyson with a desperate, pleading gaze, but his pride refused to let him surrender fully. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Just let us go, man," the thug repeated, his voice hoarse and trembling. "We're sorry. It was a joke. We didn't know who you were. We didn't mean to mess with you." Tyson stood over him, his gaze unwavering. He didn't respond immediately. His fists were still clenched at his sides, but the anger in his eyes was palpable. The homeless man, still slumped against the wall, barely moved, afraid to even breathe too loudly in the heavy silence. He could hardly believe what was happening. It was like something out of a dream. Mike Tyson was standing in front of him, protecting him from the kind of violence he had suffered his entire life. The wiry thug, still writhing on the ground, tried to pick himself up, his legs unsteady as he staggered to his feet. "Yeah," he added, his voice weak, "we didn't know it was you. Just let us go. We'll leave. You won't see us again, we swear." Tyson took a step forward, and the thugs instinctively took a step back, the fear in their eyes growing by the second. It was clear they were running out of options. They were trapped, surrounded by their own mistakes and Tyson's unyielding presence. "You think this is some joke?" Tyson asked, his voice low, but his words cut through the alley like a knife. "You think you can just mess with someone weaker than you? And when you get caught, say sorry and walk away? The tattooed thug, his face twisted in pain and fear, desperately tried to plead again. We didn't mean nothing. We're just trying to survive out here, too. Tyson shook his head, his jaw tightening as he surveyed them. Survival doesn't mean hurting others. Survival doesn't mean taking what isn't yours, making someone suffer for your amusement. You don't get to decide who's expendable. The wiry thug, now standing but still visibly shaken, glanced nervously at his fallen comrades, who were either still out cold or barely conscious. Sweat dripped down his face as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a switchblade. He gripped it tightly, his eyes darting to Tyson and then back to the ground. The air in the alley seemed to freeze as the thug flicked the blade open with a sharp snap. "You want trouble?" he growled, his voice trembling with fear but laced with defiance. "You'll get it." Tyson didn't even flinch. Before the thug could even make a move, Tyson's hand shot out in a blur of motion, snatching the blade from his grasp. The thug's eyes widened in shock as Tyson twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop the knife. Without a word, Tyson turned it in his hand and tossed the weapon to the side like it was nothing more than trash. The thug staggered back, now realizing just how hopeless his situation had become. "Is that what you were hoping for?" Tyson asked, his voice a dangerous calm. "You think pulling a knife on me will make me back down? Think again." The wiry thug looked at his comrades, their faces filled with terror and regret, before turning his gaze back to Tyson. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had no more excuses, no more bravado. He was just another man, caught in a situation too big for him to handle. "Please, man," the big thug, the one who had been knocked down earlier, croaked from the ground, struggling to lift himself. "We're sorry. We were just messing around. Let us go. We didn't mean it." Tyson's gaze shifted to the big thug, who was clearly broken, his pride shattered and his fear too overwhelming to hide. Tyson's expression softened just slightly, but his words were still firm. "You've hurt someone. That's not a mistake you get to take back. The only way you walk out of here is if I say so." The homeless man, still curled up against the wall, felt a mix of disbelief and gratitude flood his chest. Tyson wasn't just confronting these thugs for the sake of a fight. He was making a statement. He was showing them that no matter how much power they thought they had, it didn't give them the right to destroy someone else. For the first time in years, the homeless man felt like maybe, just maybe, someone cared. The wiry thug, who had tried to strike earlier, finally spoke again, his voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "We didn't know. We didn't know who you were. Please, we'll leave now. Just don't hurt us anymore." Tyson didn't immediately answer. His eyes flicked between the thugs, who were now shrinking back, their bravado completely gone. He could feel the weight of their fear, the desperation in their eyes, and yet he felt no sympathy for them. The truth was they had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with a few apologies. Tyson's face hardened. "You're not getting off that easy," Tyson said, his voice still calm but filled with authority. "You think you can just beat up someone weaker than you and say sorry and walk away? No, it doesn't work like that. There's a price for this. You're gonna remember what happens when you mess with people who can't fight back." The remaining thug, the biggest one, tried to backpedal, his body language showing that he was on the edge of panic. But Tyson took a step closer to him. The thug froze, his legs trembling as he looked up at Tyson, realizing just how little ground he had left to stand on. Tyson extended his hand toward the man, but not to help him up. He looked the thug straight in the eye, his voice turning steely and unyielding. "You've hurt someone who's already down, and you want to keep going? This is where it ends for you." The alley felt like it was closing in around the thugs. Every breath they took seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the oppressive presence of Tyson. The homeless man, still bruised and battered, could barely comprehend the scene before him. His mind swirled with disbelief as the thugs, once so confident and cruel, were now reduced to trembling, broken figures. They were still there, trying to regain some semblance of dignity, But Tyson's looming figure had already stripped them of their bravado. The wiry thug, his face flushed with both fear and frustration, took a shaky step back. "We're done, all right? We get it. You're some kind of hero. But this isn't your fight," he said, his voice low and defensive, but trembling. He shot a quick glance toward his fallen comrades. "Let us go. We won't come back. We won't mess with anyone again." Tyson didn't answer immediately. His silence was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The tattooed thug, the one who had been the most vocal, struggled to push himself up from the ground, wincing in pain with every movement. Blood trickled from his lip, his chest rising and falling erratically as he breathed heavily, still recovering from Tyson's brutal strikes. "You think I'm going to let you off because you beg?" Tyson asked coldly, his voice calm but firm. His words cut through the alley like a blade. "You think you can just say sorry and walk away after everything you've done?" The tattooed thug's gaze dropped, his pride and arrogance already shattered. His hands were trembling, and his entire body was tense, as if he feared Tyson's next move. He didn't know what else to say. The fight had drained everything out of him, and all he had left was the realization that his words meant nothing here. "We don't want no more trouble, man," the wiry thug repeated, his voice now sounding desperate. He looked to his friends, but no one dared to meet Tyson's gaze. Just let us go. We're done. We learned our lesson. We didn't mean any harm." Tyson stepped forward again, not menacing, but with a quiet, deliberate authority. The air seemed to hum with the pressure building between them. "You don't get to decide when this ends. I do." The big thug, still nursing his wounds and breathing heavily, looked at Tyson for a long moment. His resolve was weakening, the fear overtaking his pride. He had no choice but to admit the truth to himself. They were out of their depth. "Please, man," the big thug croaked, looking down at the ground in defeat. His knees wobbled as he tried to stand, his voice desperate. "I didn't mean it. I just wanted to have some fun. We weren't trying to hurt anyone." Tyson's expression didn't change, but the pause between his words carried weight. "Your fun came at someone else's expense," he said, his voice unwavering. "That's not how this works. You don't get to ruin someone's life because you think it's funny." The wiry thug, still clutching his arm where Tyson had twisted it earlier, visibly shuddered at Tyson's words. He shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his body tense, as if he wanted to run but couldn't quite gather the courage to do so. They were surrounded by walls, both literal and figurative. I said we're done," the wiry thug muttered, his words lacking the conviction he once had. "We're sorry. We don't need to do this anymore. Just let us go. We'll disappear. You'll never see us again, man." Tyson didn't even flinch, his gaze never leaving them. "I don't care if you apologize. What you did can't be undone." The thugs shifted again, each of them glancing at the others in the same desperate, fearful manner. The alley felt like it was closing in on them, every move they made only tightening the walls around them. But there was no place to run, no place to hide. Tyson was a wall they couldn't scale, a force they couldn't escape. The tattooed thug, the last one still standing, took a slow, hesitant step back, his feet dragging along the ground. He was ready to run. His body language screamed that he wanted out of this nightmare. He looked toward the end of the alley, trying to judge if Tyson would let him go. But Tyson's presence was too heavy. "Stay," Tyson said, his voice low and powerful. He wasn't asking. He wasn't giving them a choice. "You're not leaving yet. Not until I'm done with you." The thugs froze again, the fear now palpable. They had no choice but to stand their ground. They were trapped. The homeless man, still trembling but watching with a growing sense of awe, could feel the power shifting. There was no more laughter, no more threats. The bullies who had once towered over him now looked like children, shying away from the force of Tyson's unyielding presence. His heart thudded in his chest as he realized what was happening. As the thugs regrouped, unsure of how to handle the situation, Tyson didn't give them time to think. He stepped forward again, this time more deliberate, pushing them back with his mere presence. They staggered, their bodies forced to move back in response, like ants before a boot. "I'm giving you one chance," Tyson said, his voice cold, a warning laced with finality. "Walk away now, and you leave here with your pride barely intact. Fight me, and I'll show you exactly what happens when you pick the wrong fight." The wiry thug, shaking uncontrollably, finally took a tentative step back, his voice trembling. "We don't want trouble," he said, barely above a whisper. But his words were weak, just empty noise against the storm that Tyson had unleashed. The tattooed thug, still clutching his side where Tyson had hit him earlier, looked from his friends to Tyson and back again, but no one moved. They knew this was no longer a situation they could control. The atmosphere was electric, the air crackling with the unspoken agreement that they had lost. Tyson's hand hovered over his belt, his fingers flexing, ready to act if they made one wrong move. His eyes never wavered. His body remained still, but the tension in his muscles was enough to make even the most hardened thug second-guess his next move. But as the seconds dragged on, it became clear. The thugs had no more fight left in them. And Tyson, standing tall in front of them, didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone made the words unnecessary. The alley grew heavy with tension, the air thick with the stench of sweat and fear. The thugs stood frozen in place, no longer filled with the bravado they had started with. The wiry thug, his body trembling, could barely stand upright. His eyes darted to his companions, who were no better off. They were still nursing wounds, still trapped by their own decisions. And now they stood, helpless before the unrelenting force of Tyson's presence. Tyson didn't move, didn't say anything. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat he could have uttered. He let the silence stretch out, watching the men like a predator, waiting for them to make the next move. The thugs, though, had no moves left to make. "Come on, man," the tattooed thug stammered, trying to summon some of his previous defiance. "This is crazy. We're not doing this anymore. We're done. Just let us go, all right? We can walk away from this." His voice was full of desperation now, no longer the taunting edge he had once had. His body was stiff, his fists still clenched, but he didn't dare make another move toward Tyson. Tyson's gaze hardened. "I didn't start this," he replied flatly, his voice low and authoritative. "You did. You think you can walk around terrorizing people because you're bigger or tougher?" His words weren't a question. They were a statement, punctuated with the silence that followed. Tyson stepped forward again, taking a slow, deliberate step that pushed the thugs back. The space between them shrank, and their retreat became more instinctual. The wiry thug's knees buckled slightly as he tried to regain his footing. He wasn't sure if he could keep standing, but he wasn't about to beg. He glanced at his tattooed companion, looking for some sort of direction. But the tattooed thug was clearly not in the position to lead anymore. "You've got no more tricks left," Tyson's voice cut through their hesitation. "You think you can intimidate people and get away with it? You've got no power here." His eyes locked onto the wiry thug, who was still trying to stand tall, but every inch of him screamed uncertainty. "You should have learned that by now." The big thug, who had been silent since his brutal takedown, finally managed to lift his head. He wiped blood from his lips, his body still aching from Tyson's forceful blows. We didn't mean it," he muttered, his voice weak. "We were just messing around. Nothing personal. Just looking for some fun. Didn't think it'd turn out like this." Tyson looked at him coldly. "Messing around? Is that what you call it? Fun?" His voice had a hard edge now, the disgust clear. "You don't hurt people for fun. You don't get to play games with someone's life." The thugs looked at one another, their eyes darting between Tyson and the homeless man, who was still hunched against the wall, barely moving. The situation was deteriorating for them, and they knew it. Their strength, their numbers, their weapons, they were useless against Tyson. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real weight was in their own guilt, now palpable and suffocating. They had crossed a line, and no amount of begging or threats could erase that. The wiry thug let out a shaky breath, glancing around nervously. "We didn't mean to mess with him," he said in a shaky voice. his gaze finally shifting to the homeless man. "We didn't think it'd go this far. We just wanted to get something for ourselves." Tyson's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping lower, each word heavier than the last. "You think you can hurt someone, take what's not yours, and walk away scot-free? You don't get to do that. This is real life, and you can't make excuses when you've already gone too far." The thug winced at Tyson's words, but it wasn't just fear that held him in place now. It was the realization of what they had done. They had crossed a line, and now they were trapped in their own actions. They had nothing left but humiliation and fear, but they weren't ready to face that yet. "Please," the tattooed thug whispered, his voice weak. "We didn't know. We thought he was just a nobody. We didn't think it'd turn out like this." Tyson's response was instant, his voice low but laced with disgust. "Doesn't matter what you thought. You hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and now you have to deal with it. You think you can walk away from that? You're wrong." The wiry thug looked at the others in desperation, but none of them were ready to argue. They had no words left. It was clear that Tyson was in complete control. Every second they stayed in that alley, the more powerless they felt. Tyson was a force of nature, an immovable object in their path. They had come here thinking they could pick on someone weaker than them. But now they realized too late that Tyson wasn't just any man. He was a wall they couldn't scale. Still, they weren't ready to admit defeat. One last time, the tattooed thug tried to muster some courage, but his words faltered. We didn't think anyone would stand up to us," he muttered, his voice trailing off as he looked at the others. They were still trembling, the realization of their situation sinking in. The wiry thug glanced up at Tyson, his body tense with fear. "Please," he begged. "We're just trying to survive. We didn't know who you were." Tyson's gaze shifted, his eyes piercing into the thug's soul. "You don't get to choose who you hurt. You don't get to say sorry and walk away like nothing happened." The air between them was thick with anticipation, the situation growing more intense by the second. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, was now murmuring, their phones still recording every moment of the standoff. For Tyson, this wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about putting an end to something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. The tension in the alley had reached a breaking point. The thugs, battered and bruised, were barely standing, their will to fight stripped away by Tyson's unrelenting presence. The cold, damp air felt heavier now, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. The homeless man, still pressed against the wall, was breathing heavily, watching in stunned silence. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. How one man had taken control of the entire situation. And Tyson wasn't done yet. Tyson stood tall, his chest rising and falling steadily as he surveyed the remaining thugs. The fear was palpable, and it lingered in the air like an electric charge. The tattooed thug, still trembling, tried to take a step back, but Tyson's gaze never wavered. "I've given you every chance," Tyson said, his voice deep and filled with quiet authority. "You've had your warning. You think you can walk away from this?" The wiry thug, whose body was still shaking from the earlier confrontation, glanced at his comrades. His throat tightened as he swallowed hard. He had been ready to fight, to run, to make a stand, but now there was nothing left. His body betrayed him. He didn't want to die here, not in this dark alley, and not at the hands of someone like Tyson. But the big thug, the one who had been knocked down earlier, took a deep breath, steeling himself. His pride was still intact, though just barely. His fists clenched, and he tried to stand tall. "We're not going down without a fight," he growled, though his voice trembled, betraying his fear. Tyson didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the thug with the crowbar, the one who had been the most stubborn. "You're done," Tyson said, his voice colder now, filled with an icy finality that made the thug freeze in place. "You think you're tough? You think you can just take a weapon and threaten someone weaker than you and walk away? Not today." The big thug raised his hands as if to defend himself, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. "We didn't know who you were," he muttered, backing away slowly. We didn't know you were gonna make a scene. It's just a joke. Just some fun. We won't hurt anyone anymore. All right? Tyson took a single step forward. His shadow loomed over the thug like a giant, overpowering and inevitable. Jokes don't hurt people. You hurt someone because you thought you could. And that's where I step in. With that, Tyson's hand shot out, grabbing the big thug by the throat and lifting him off the ground with ease. The thug's feet kicked uselessly, his eyes wide with terror. His hands clawed at Tyson's arm, but it was no use. Tyson's grip was a vice. The crowd watching in the distance gasped in unison, their eyes wide with disbelief. "You're gonna regret every moment of this," Tyson growled. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the thug's panic like a blade. "You hurt someone who couldn't fight back. Now you get to feel what it's like to be powerless." The wiry thug, seeing the fate of his friend, took another step back. His voice cracked as he spoke, his body trembling. "Please, man, let him go. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. We just wanted some money, some food. We were just hungry." Tyson didn't respond. He just stared down at the thug in his grip. He could feel the man's pulse pounding in his throat, the panic radiating off him in waves. For a moment, Tyson considered his next move, his face unreadable. Then, with a sharp movement, Tyson tossed the big thug to the side, sending him crashing into the trash bins. The thug hit the ground hard, his body sprawling out like a rag doll. He lay there, unable to move, groaning in pain. The alley was silent now, save for the groans of the thug on the ground and the heavy breathing of the others. The wiry thug, now thoroughly terrified, looked at his friends. Two of them unconscious and the big one knocked out cold. He was all alone, and the realization hit him like a slap. Tyson stepped forward again, his eyes narrowing. "You should have walked away when I told you to. Now you're gonna feel the weight of your actions." The wiry thug's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, hands raised in surrender. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean it." His voice was full of desperation, each word coming out in a frantic rush. Tyson's gaze softened for a brief moment. He stood over the thug, towering like a mountain. "You don't get to apologize now," Tyson said, his voice low and firm. "You've already done the damage. This isn't about apologies. This is about understanding what it means to take responsibility." For the first time, the wiry thug understood that there was no escape. He looked at the homeless man, still pressed against the wall, his face pale and bloodied, and realized that it wasn't just about survival. It was about what they had done to someone who couldn't protect himself. Tyson turned to face the homeless man, his eyes softening just slightly. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than any words. The homeless man's breathing had slowed, but he still couldn't move. He was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, but for the first time in ages, he felt like someone cared. Someone had come to stop the violence, to fight back against the cruelty of the world. The wiry thug, still on his knees, started to shake violently, his body trembling under the weight of Tyson's gaze. He was broken mentally, physically, emotionally. There was no escape for him now. "You're not getting away from this," Tyson said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was like thunder in the alley. "This ends here. You leave and you stay away from people who can't fight back. If you do this again, you won't be so lucky." The wiry thug nodded frantically, his voice barely audible. I won't. Just let me go." Tyson didn't answer. He turned his back on the thug and moved toward the homeless man, offering him a steady hand to help him up. The homeless man, still in shock, took it, his fingers trembling as he gripped Tyson's hand. "You okay?" Tyson asked, his voice softer now. The homeless man nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Tyson replied quietly, his gaze meeting the man's. "Just take care of yourself. That's enough." Tyson turned back toward the fallen thugs. "You leave now and you stay gone. If I ever see you again, it won't end this way." With that, he walked away, leaving the thugs to wallow in their defeat. The crowd in the alley started to disperse, their whispers growing louder as they discussed what they had just witnessed. The homeless man, still holding on to Tyson's words, felt something stirring inside him. A sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. The alley was eerily quiet now, save for the soft hum of traffic in the distance and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The tension that had filled the air only moments ago seemed to dissipate, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. The thugs, once so full of themselves, now lay scattered on the ground, beaten and broken. The wiry thug, who had been the most desperate of them all, clutched his side, unable to even look Tyson in the eye. His body trembled, both from pain and humiliation. He could barely make sense of the situation. The big thug was still lying unconscious, sprawled across the pavement like a discarded ragdoll. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, his pride shattered, his strength gone. The tattooed thug, who had once seemed invincible, was now nursing his wounds and staring at the ground, his expression one of sheer defeat. The homeless man, still sitting against the wall, couldn't process everything that had happened. His hands were shaking, his body covered in bruises, but he had never felt more alive. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt something akin to hope. He didn't know who this man was or why Tyson had stepped in for him, but it didn't matter. Tyson had stopped the violence, had given him back something that had been stripped away from him for so long. His dignity. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle had thinned out, the whispers and murmurs of disbelief continuing to echo in the alley. People were talking about what they had witnessed, some recording the scene on their phones, others still trying to process the sheer force of Tyson's intervention. The homeless man, though, barely noticed the crowd anymore. All he could do was focus on the figure in front of him, the man who had changed everything. Tyson stood there for a moment, watching the defeated thugs, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in his face, no gloating. He had done what needed to be done, but the aftermath didn't bring him joy. He was simply a man who had acted out of principle, not vengeance. "You still alive?" Tyson asked, his voice softer now as he turned toward the homeless man, who looked up at him, dazed and exhausted. The homeless man nodded slowly, still in shock. I think so," he said hoarsely, his throat tight as he tried to gather his thoughts. "I didn't know what to expect. I didn't think anyone would step in for me. I didn't think anyone cared." Tyson crouched down beside him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "People care," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "They just need someone to remind them. That's why we have to stand up for each other." The homeless man blinked, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't expected to shed. He had no words to offer Tyson, no way to express the gratitude swelling inside him. His life had been one of quiet suffering, of being ignored, dismissed, and trampled on by society. But in this moment, all of that had shifted. A stranger, a man with the power to destroy, had chosen to save him instead. And now, for the first time in ages, he could feel a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. Tyson helped him to his feet, his hands steady and supportive. The homeless man's legs were shaky at first, the effort of standing making him dizzy, but Tyson didn't let go. He held him steady until he was sure the man wouldn't collapse. "Take it easy," Tyson said, his voice low. "You're gonna be all right. I'm not gonna let anyone hurt you again." The homeless man managed a shaky breath, and for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to relax, to trust. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tyson gave him a small nod, his expression softening. "It's not about thanking me. It's about standing up. For yourself, for others." The wiry thug, still on the ground, now seemed to grasp the full weight of his actions. His chest was heaving as he struggled to regain some control over his breath. His body no longer the instrument of violence it had been moments ago. "We didn't mean it. We were just looking for a way to survive," he muttered, his words broken, lacking conviction. He could barely meet Tyson's gaze, the shame evident on his face. Tyson, now standing, turned toward the thug. His voice was still calm, but there was an undeniable hardness to it. Survival isn't about hurting others. It's about being better than that. The tattooed thug, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know it was going to go this far. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. We were just trying to get by. We didn't think about what it would do to him." Tyson's gaze remained steady as he looked at them. "It doesn't matter what you thought. What matters is what you did." His words were like a hammer, hitting the thugs with the full weight of their consequences. "You're not walking away unscathed, but you'll walk away and you'll learn something today. Don't hurt people just because you can. Don't hurt people because they're easier to hurt." There was a long silence in the alley. The thugs, bruised and broken, didn't respond. They had nothing left to say. They had no more pride, no more fight. Their arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of their actions. Tyson turned back to the homeless man, who was still standing, his legs steadier now but his face filled with confusion and disbelief. "You good?" Tyson asked, his voice softer now, as though recognizing the toll the entire situation had taken on him. The homeless man nodded, though his eyes were glassy, the weight of everything hitting him all at once. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I'm good. Thanks to you." Tyson smiled briefly, but there was no joy in it, no satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done. "Just remember," Tyson said, as he started to walk away, "don't let anyone ever make you feel small again." The thugs were still sitting on the ground, nursing their wounds, unable to move. They had no energy left to fight, no words left to defend themselves. They had been defeated, humiliated, and were now forced to reflect on what had just transpired. Tyson, without another word, turned and left the alley, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had arrived. The silence that followed was deafening. The homeless man watched him go, his mind swirling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't invisible. The thugs, still huddled together on the ground, couldn't bring themselves to move. They were broken, exhausted, humiliated. Their arrogance had been shattered, their pride left in tatters. The homeless man, once just an invisible bystander, was now left standing taller, if only because of the unwavering support he had received. The crowd, which had quietly watched from the sidelines, began to disperse. Phones clicked off, and murmurs of disbelief filled the air. But no one looked at the homeless man with disdain. Instead, they walked away with a new sense of respect for what they had witnessed. Some may have never fully understood it, but they had seen something rare that night. A man who stood up not only for himself but for someone else. The homeless man took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He looked down the alley one last time, the place where he had been left alone for so long, and then turned away. Tyson's actions had reminded him that, no matter how broken or forgotten you were, there was always someone out there willing to fight for you.